Kokoda sits as a region around the track and within PNG, right there running across the spine of the Long Peninsula. And it encompasses a fairly large area which is highly biodiverse. It has quite a lot of value, and that value is recognised by the government of PNG and the Australian government. And it covers quite a range of altitudes and environments. As we go through this process, I'm not going to do your work for you and tell you which SDGs apply where. I will leave that for you. What I will say is that pretty much all of them, apart from maybe number 14, which is life under the water, do apply at some point. What most people know about Kokoda is the historical significance, or at least let's say most Australians. And that is to do with the history around the Kokoda Track campaign, which was fought between Australia and Japan. The area is on a tentative list for World Heritage status, which means it's in that kind of grey zone. One thing that we do know historically is that there wasn't much interest in Kokoda really until quite recently. In 2001, there were about 76 people or tourists who walked the Kokoda Track. And that number has increased so that the peak in around 2013 to 15 was around 5,000 to 6,000 per year. So there's some significant change going on. Culturally, it's relatively diverse. There are two main cultural groups, the Koiari and the Oroqova. They are the traditional owners of the region. They are proud of their cultural traditions. There is a degree to which they are very keen to protect their environment and their traditions, but that is also balanced with a desire to make a good living and to have access to services. And some of that is demonstrated in significant outmigration from that region. The traditional culture has also been overlaid with Christian cultures. There is a significant influence in the population there. These slides are just very quickly to give you a sense. Within the red circles, that's the area we're looking at. And the sense I want you to get is there that the population density is not all that high. And it's fairly scattered because we're talking some very rugged terrain and not enormous numbers of people. One of the things that adds complexity to the situation in Kokoda is that it is not just a place in Papua New Guinea where people from there live. As I suggested, because of the historical links with Australia, it is a part of PNG that the Australian government has a particular interest in, to the extent that there is a high-level agreement between the governments of Australia and PNG, specifically about what can and cannot happen in this space. And that was renewed in 2015, and it's signed at Prime Minister level. Because of that interest, the Australian government has funded a certain amount of community development work in the Kokoda region, particularly since 2010. That has focused quite heavily on health and education type of outcomes. There is a commitment of additional funds for the current period that we're in now, so it was from 2016 to 2020, of up to 25 million. It would probably be fair to say not a lot of that is actually moving at the moment. The other aspect of Australian involvement, beyond the Australian government and the aid program, is that there is a great deal of trekking and tourism. There are currently about 36 tour operators that are registered with, and here's an acronym for you, the KTA, the Kokoda Track Authority. And the Kokoda Track Authority is a quasi-government entity in PNG that exists to manage tourist activity along the Kokoda Track. The majority of the trekking and tour operators are Australian owned and operated. There are some local ones. In 2012, which is the most recent information I could get, there was a study done on the economic significance of trekking and tourism, and they calculated the total economic value in 2011, which was not at the peak, that was at about half of the peak, at about 15 million Australian dollars. You will note then that the next point there is that the direct expenditure accruing to villages on the track was about $1.8 million. And that is because much of that $15 million, roughly a third, is airfares. Of the rest, about half stays in Australia, and about half is spent in PNG. There are a lot of different stakeholders involved in Kokoda. That's the list there of the primary ones. The Kokoda Initiative, that is the Australian government's aid program. So you can see a range of non-government, private sector, quasi-government and government, as well as local communities and clans. And the clan system is still quite a powerful impact on local decision making. So we'll talk about some of the development challenges. Economically, your challenges tend to be around livelihoods and use of resources and competing uses of resources and who gets access to them and who makes a living out of them and in what ways. Politically, it's quite complex because you have so many different layers of government. The area around the track is actually split between two provinces in PNG, and so you have at least 7 levels of government just within PNG engaged, and then you have the Australian government added into that. And so that can be challenging. Socially, it is quite an isolated part of the world, as we'll see when we go into a bit more detail around a particular village. And the outmigration that happens is significant socially. Ecologically, it's as I said, environmentally sensitive, and there is a challenge around protection versus use for livelihoods. And culturally, wherever you've got tourism and local cultures mixing, there's the possibility for good outcomes, but also for challenging outcomes. So we're going to dive quickly into a particular village. This is Kagi, and that's it in the photo there. It is a village that does not have road access to anywhere else. It has an airport, and that's fortunate for it because there are some villages that don't even have airports. A lot of the analysis across communities depends on whether they have access to the outside world, so whether there's a road and an airport or just an airport, or neither. What you see there on the graph, just quickly, is that the largest portion of income is from tourism. That includes payments from the Kokoda Track Authority, who take fees from the trekking companies and pass them on, but it also includes sale of things. In the blue, that's market sales in Port Moresby and the village. Some of that's tourism related. And then the green is remittances from family members who are living outside. And interestingly enough, that's quite small because in some cases up to 60% of the population is living outside of the village, and yet the remittances are not large. Assets in terms of the age groups, mostly adults with then school age and non-school age children, making up just slightly less than half. The majority are still in the village, but there's a very large red section there that are living in Port Moresby. So this village is at about 1,400 metres above sea level. There's a lot of primary forest still, so you can see there's reasonably good conservation in that space, but then secondary forest shows areas that have been used. The airstrip is key here because it's the way in and out. There's an elementary school and an aid post. Kids can walk to a lower and upper primary school. Elementary school in PNG is preschool. And the secondary boarding school would be in the main provincial town. I'll show you this slide just to give you a sense of the range of stakeholders involved in this community. So you've got what was at that stage when this study was done, AusAid, but DFAT, Department of Environment and Conservation, Kokoda Development Program, Kokoda Track Authority, Kokoda Track Foundation, which is an NGO that specialises in working in Kokoda, national government, sub-national government, PNG law and justice sector, tour companies. It's a small village, it's relatively isolated, but all these people and all these organisations, actors, have an interest. Internally, then you have the clan groups, you have community-based mentors, some of which are coming out of the Kokoda Track Authority. You have local government and you have local church. Livelihood strategies going on in this community. There are subsistence activities, gardening, fishing, hunting, and collecting of firewood and non-timber forest products. Market sales in Port Moresby or the village itself. either to tourists or the reverse people, porters who move backwards and forwards up the trail with their work, carrying on some business activities as part of that, and then part-time tourist activities. So guest houses in this village, there are 5 that are part of the KTA certification program. You'll note there that the village has now found itself not on the main trekking thoroughfare, and so that's another factor. Some of the broader issues out there, climate change factors, social issues, and political trends that particularly have impact around use of resources. This was from a study looking at livelihoods, and the key conclusions were that there needed to be an acceptable and realistic work program for growing local economic opportunities, and that it needed to be a collaborative exercise. I'll give you very briefly just a quick perspective on an NGO engagement process. I'm drawing this from ADRA, Papua New Guinea. This is not meant to be something that says, oh, this is the way to do it. This is not a case study of a successfully completed systems thinking collaboration type of effort. This is actually representing a fairly traditional approach from an NGO and a very early stage. ADRA in Papua New Guinea has recently decided to engage in the Kokoda region, and ADRA Australia, which is where I work, has supported that. Looking at all of the things that they identified through assessments, they chose to focus around working with 5 communities, looking at essentially sustainable well-being and livelihoods, and they felt that an approach that looked at those 3 areas of capacity building, advocacy and service delivery was probably something that might work. As I say, fairly standard NGO approaches to doing things. That's about where I'm going to pull up. And if there are questions that people would like to ask, it actually changes periodically. Over time, trekking companies will make decisions about security, about cost effectiveness, about access to services like guest houses or porters. And it can also be influenced by local community making decisions about whether they're happy to have trekkers coming through. I guess it depends on how fit and healthy you are. Most trekking companies would be in there for at least a week, and some might have longer. I think up to 2 weeks can happen. Depends on side trips, rest days. A week if you're really fast and don't stop for anything. I would guess local communities would actually be kind of happy to have more rest days because that's more time for people spending in there. But trekking companies, on the other hand, would like to keep things moving because anytime you're on a rest day, you're spending money but not necessarily making it. Probably leans more towards the self-contained. In talking with trekking companies, many of them have long-term relationships with the area. Some of them have been trekking there since 2000, if not engaged earlier. And many of them say they would like to purchase more locally from within communities rather than being self-contained. And so that could potentially suggest opportunities. Most of the communities, as I said, are quite traditional. Almost all of them are Christian. So in some cases, you have a scenario where Christian or tribal elders are unhappy with the influence on young people of meeting with tourists who might take a different approach culturally to things. Particular example would be in some communities keeping of Sabbath, which is a rest day for Christian traditions, but trekking companies want to keep working, so porters are having to make a decision. Do I follow the religious tradition I have, or do I work on that day? From the perspective of the Australian government and the trekking companies, they would be quite happy if you preserved the environment as it is right now and never, harmed a flower or a blade of grass or anything, because that works for trekking companies. The more pristine the environment, the better. And from the perspective of many of them that engage from the war history, it's a memorial. So it's a place that has, deep meaning, and they would like to see it preserved as is. That does come into tension with local communities who see the natural resources as a way to make a living. If you're not successfully making a great living out of the tourism side, what is the incentive to conserve, when in fact maybe you could make a living out of cutting things down and selling them? That's an aspect where you could have tension between external parties and local communities, but tension within local communities where different people are benefiting in different ways from those resources. And then, of course, you have the potential World Heritage listing status sitting there, which, if achieved, could be a bonus in some ways for the country. But again, it comes back to who's benefiting and how.
Yeah, so basically Mark has done the first stage for us of the situational description, which normally you would do through various different means. You might do desktop studies, you might use, if you've got in-field staff, you would talk to them, you would go and talk to the government. You would use multiple sources of information to kind of set your baseline. You can see the depth and the breadth of the information that Mark collected. I think you don't need to necessarily go overboard, but the more information you have about the situation, the easier it is for this next stage, which is the systems assessment. The systems assessment is split up into three key parts. The first is identifying the key issues and their causes. So really identifying what we call in RAPTA key issues, the causes, the controlling variables. Because these are things that if you do an intervention, you potentially can change that cause. You can mitigate that cause. You can reduce the adverse effects on whatever your issue is that you've identified. You can't always change the controlling variables. That's where RAPTA focuses on is, are there interventions that you can put in place that can change those controlling variables so that you get that ball to spin out of the hole that it's in, that it's stuck into a next more resilient and adaptive system. The second part of it is to do a causal loop analysis of key issues, and we'll take you through that and talk to you about how you would identify interventions after you've done your causal loop analysis and how these interventions potentially can address the SDGs. And then finally, who should be involved. And this is really critical when it comes to who do you need to work with you so that you can change the system. So it's understanding who are all the players in the system, but you don't necessarily have to work with all of them, but identifying who the key players are that you think could make a difference in working with you.